Moments before recording this podcast, I put a contact in my eye and didn't realize that I had already had one in there. And boy, does it hurt to put two contacts in your eyes. Okay, so today I want to take it back to basics a little bit by talking about restriction, which is one of the most common ways that we talk about causes for overeating and binge eating. But I'm also aware that for some people who might be new to this podcast or new to the idea of intuitive eating or non diet approaches, that understanding restriction in the context of why we mass consume food or just overly consume food, even by a little bit, can be new. So I wanted to lay the groundwork for understanding that when we're eating more than we quote unquote need, that most of the time that's not about gluttony and it's not about wanting too much. It's usually actually coming from a feeling of scarcity that lives underneath it, either real or perceived. And this can exist in four different ways. One of the ways that we're going to talk about is the most commonly understood version of restriction and a review for some of you, although I do have some caveats I'd like to make note of. The second form that we're going to talk about is something that usually requires more explanation and nuance because it's the least understood and the most insidious. The third form of restriction is much lesser known. And the fourth type of restriction I'm going to talk about today has never been talked about anywhere else because it is my own personal theory that I am, for the very first time, putting out into my content. I have not talked about this before in this specific way, but I'm adding it to the way that I conceptualize and see people struggling with restrictions. And please forgive my eye. Um, okay, so the first level of restriction is physical restriction. So what is physical restriction? It is definitely the most commonly understood restriction and probably the one that everybody thinks about the most when they think about this term or when they hear this term. So this one is the actual reduction in the amount of food that you're taking in. So eating less than your body needs. It's more stereotypical. So not eating very much throughout a day, skipping meals, eating a small amount of calories, that quintessential kind of like not eating a lot kind of thing. And what we know is that for some people, the body rebels against this. And when we're not getting enough nourishment to sustain our basic functions, the body will rebel by increasing the desire for food. And that is part of what can result in binging. The thing about physical restriction that I find the most interesting working with people who do physically restrict is that most people who physically restrict don't necessarily present in this stereotypical way. So some people do, and some people will own and understand that, like, yes, I actively restrict. I know that I restrict. I eat less than I probably need, and that's the way that I stay safe, and that's the way that I have been negotiating food for a long time. But many times people are physically restricting and don't realize it. I was actually one of these people. And I want to explain this one to you because it's really important and lesser understood. So I live in a mid-sized body. That means that I am at the upper end of straight size. So I sit at around a size 12. You know, I can fluctuate a bit. And of course, depending on who says what even a size 12 is, because it's different in every store, but I'm generally around a size 12. Um, I didn't think I should be a size 12. On top, I actually am smaller. And so I always identified and wanted to be a smaller bodied person. I wanted to be smaller than this. I was kind of like just always a slightly bigger than my peers and my friends growing up and things like that. I was like that kid in the fifth grade health class where they weigh you in front of everybody, where I was one of the ones that was 100 pounds, whereas everybody else was like 90. And that, set a stage for me to be like, I'm too big. And I always felt that way after that. And my feeling was that my body wanted to be bigger than it was supposed to be. This was just the way I inherited the story. So I ate because, for a period of time I did actively physically restrict pretty chronically, but my appetite, within a couple years rebelled against that. And I couldn't just eat a very, very small amount of food. And so I was eating in a way that I would have told you at the time was enough because it went along with what I thought were like reasonable amounts. I ate all of my meals. I ate all of the food groups even. And I, at some points in my life, was eating in a way that would have been prescribed to me by like whoever makes up the rules about what everybody should eat. This whole idea of like a 2,000 calorie standard diet. It's so funny that we think about that as like applicable to all because there's wide range of needs in the world. But I would have said, like, I'm not eating too little. I'm eating my meals. I can't be physically restricting. And what I didn't realize was that my body wanted to be a certain size that required me to eat more than the recommended daily allowance. And so I wasn't actually eating enough for my body, even though I might have been eating enough for my friend's body over here, right? Like, so there were times in my life where I was doing the quote unquote right thing. I was eating quote unquote responsibly. I was meeting each meal in a way that felt to me like I was trying really hard to, like, even to compromise with diet culture a little bit, to be like, look, I'm having the standard portion that is prescribed, but it wasn't enough for me. And while I also had competing variables of mental restriction, which we'll talk about, and other kinds of restriction which were unduly influencing me alongside of the physical restriction, I now look back and I'm able to see you weren't necessarily physically restricting according to the stereotypical ways of looking at it, but you were restricting when it comes to how much your body needed, because I was constantly trying to suppress my weight to be smaller than midsize. I wouldn't have been called underweight by any doctor. I wasn't trying to be a size that seems unreasonable to the naked eye, but it was for me. And so if your body is designed or genetically predisposed to wanting to be bigger than you want it to be, even if where you want it to be sounds like it's reasonable, if it's not in your genetic code, it's still a physical restriction. And so my intake was not matching up to what my body actually needed. And looking back now, I'm like, I really wasn't so terribly far off, but I was coming in under. And that was my aim every day, was to come in under where I actually now understand I need to be. And so my body would have experienced that as a physical restriction. It wasn't getting quite enough calories. It wasn't getting quite enough macronutrients in the ratios that it needed to be where I am now comfortable. And in that way, sometimes even things like portion control can be a way of physically restricting. It can still be like I'm giving myself a portion of something, I'm not having it, but I'm limiting the amounts based on either extreme standards of what diet culture prescribes, and they do, especially when you're looking at, remember those old school magazines? Because aren't magazines old school now? But they used to have those, those 2-week meal plans in the back, and the amount of food that they would put, like 1,400 calories, even up to like 1,800 calories, was too small. It's like too small for me. And I'm not saying that's, well, I'm not going to prescribe anything, but that was too little for me. But again, it looked like portion control. And so portion control itself, if you're not eating enough of what you actually need, can be a version of physical restriction, as can things like low carb, clean eating, even low fat, no sugar, no flour, anything that excludes something. It excludes a category of foods. And this is going to start to blend into mental restriction, which we'll talk about. But when you have a rule about the things that you can't have, there is a physical restriction involved. Invariably, I get questions about this, like, what if I have an allergy? Or what if certain foods really don't sit well with me? Or what if I don't like eating dessert at night because it makes me have rough sleep or reflux at, when I lay down and things like that. And this is something that is probably worth another episode, but I don't believe that every single time you don't eat something, that it's a restriction in the way we think about restriction. I do not believe that every time you don't eat something, it's pathological. If that were true, we would be just as boxed in, right? But when we're coming from a place of like, I feel like I can't have something because if I do, I'm not good enough, or there's some kind of morality attached to it, that's a different thing than saying I need to take care of myself by not eating so close to bedtime because I know I get a physical reaction from that. The way that we're restricting absolutely has to do with, is this restriction or not? And again, this is a language issue. Restriction is a word that is used to represent a whole lot of things. And when I'm talking about it as the cause of overeating and binge eating, I'm talking about it in a way that's got some kind of morality or fear or attachment embedded in it, not just a way of making choices and sometimes saying no to those choices. However, physical restriction can also come with being without intent. So I sometimes work with people who find themselves night eating, and they come to me and they're like, I don't know what's going on with me. I'm fine all day, and then at night I'm binging. And sometimes when we get into it, it really comes down to the fact that while they're at work all day and their adrenaline's going and they're really, really busy, they're just sort of quote unquote powering through these meals. Maybe they're eating a little here and there, but they're not eating enough. And it doesn't have to be because they're trying not to. It still may result in the same thing, right? So if the body is not getting what it needs, and what it needs is not always what you think it needs, it may need more carbohydrates or more calories or whatever. It will eventually go to take them back, whether or not you're doing it on purpose. But largely what I see when people are struggling with food are things like, trying to skip lunch like a coworker does, or this idea of, well, I'm not, I can kind of push my hunger off until midday, so I just don't have any breakfast. And sometimes, we get away with that in the daytime again, because we can override those signals with busyness, but it still would qualify as restriction if we are in fact eating at night. And I will also say this about physical restriction. It really doesn't matter what your friend is doing or what your partner or your sister or your colleague is doing in terms of, if they're skipping meals, if they're restricting carbohydrates or whatever it is. And we also don't know what goes on behind their closed doors, but let's say that they are restricting and they're not binging and they're not overeating and they are sort of like maintaining a smaller body. If you are someone who struggles with binge eating and overeating and the cause of that is restriction, it really doesn't matter what someone else's body can or can't do. I'm really passionate about this one, that we need to keep our eyes on our own plate and understand that if your body is giving you a signal that it's hungry at the end of a day, and you think that if your friend ate the same amount of food as you, she wouldn't be hungry at the end of the day, and you think that's a you problem, it's not. It's a biological genetic difference, or it's a situational. There's something different between that body and your body. And the only body you need to be concerned about is yours, especially if you're struggling. So binge eating is often a sign there is a restriction taking place, many times within a physical restriction. Not always. And we'll talk about the other ways this can look, but oftentimes, especially if you're somebody who's really attached to ideas of healthy eating, clean eating, and this lesser known disorder called orthorexia, which is restricting food based on food morality and health concerns that are more about our attachment to an identity and fear than they are about the actual health outcomes. Again, an episode for another time. One nuance of physical restriction that I think is important to name is that people can become afraid that they're physically restricting, because when you do understand the link between restricting your food and binge eating or overeating, you can start to feel like you're not allowed to ever say no thank you to a food because you're afraid it might make you binge or overeat. And that is slippery, because that kind of makes you feel like you always have to say yes to food or else you're restricting. And that's actually not true. However, if you are in an active state of coming out of restrictions or have been doing that your whole life and you're trying to deconstruct this is where permission to eat and saying yes to food without thinking about why you should say no thank you or trying to be too discriminate about what you're eating can be really helpful, because in the beginning your body is just looking for that permission. But there is also room to learn how to say no thank you to food. This is something that I talk about in my Refining Intuitive course, because I was finding that a lot of people who were moving through recovery were then afraid to say no because they thought everything was a restriction, and it's not always. However, if this concept is new to you and you know that you have been restricting for a long time, and you've had a problem eating enough or saying yes to certain food groups and fear dominates, then this is something to look at and consider more closely. But let's go to number 2, which is mental restriction. So mental restriction is, I think, the most common. I think it's within all of us. And I think that it's within all of us because we all have grown up in food morality and diet culture to some degree. And it's also invisible. So physical restriction is actively not eating enough. You can kind of see it almost. It's concrete. It's counting calories or portion control. Whereas mental restriction is your thoughts. It's mental. It's invisible entirely. So the way that this usually presents is that many, many people who strictly binge eat or overeat and don't identify at all with restriction because they don't ever, even if they wanted to diet or not eat carbohydrates or eat smaller portions, even if they wanted to, they can't. And you can be binging every single day and still be wildly mentally restricting. I did this I would say I probably did this for more years than anything else. My entire freshman year of college was only binge eating every day. I don't know if I had a day where I didn't. And certainly for a period of time, it would have been, I mean, morning till night. This was one of the most out of control periods that I ever had. If you had talked to me at that time about restriction, I would have gotten really angry because I would have resented the fact that you were suggesting I was restricting when I was doing the very, very opposite. And actually my parents, my mom in particular, used to say to me, like, because I was coming off of a restrictive period from high school, she just kind of used to think I was exaggerating, and that, I would feel so angry because I knew that I would sometimes wake up in the morning and go to our dining hall, and I would be like, I'm not going to classes today. And I would pretend like I was getting food for the entire like floor I lived on and really eat it all, and eat it while my roommate was out for the day. Right from the get-go, right from her 8 a.m. class, she was out the door. I was right after her, ready to binge. And I would binge all the live long day through. Um, there was nobody at that time who would have ever looked at me and said, "You're not eating enough." But I was judging the hell out of myself. I was disgusted by myself, and every single food that I ate was eaten with some kind of remorse and shame about it. Now, this story is, as many of my stories can be, like on a spectrum, right? Like it's an extreme part of the spectrum, and I use it to illustrate how much vitriol it can have in it. Like the way that we talk to ourselves, the way that we criticize ourselves and condemn ourselves for our lack of willpower is the mental restriction. So implicit a lot of times in this, whether you're on a high spectrum of this or even just like a moderate spectrum. And I think like everyday diet culture is like this, right? So even if you're not somebody who identifies with being quite so drastic about it, it can be actually harder to identify this way. But the way this might look is, you are out to lunch with a friend and you eat a sandwich while your friend eats a salad, and you order dessert and you eat a fair share of dessert. And all the while, you're kind of like, oh, I really shouldn't be eating so much. I really actually need to be losing weight. I just I don't have the willpower to eat the salad like you do. Or, like I just can't resist dessert, but you know what, tomorrow I'll be better. Or, I really got to get it. It could be just more of an abstract, I got to get it together soon. Or even somewhere in the back of my head, like, I know eating sugar is bad for me. Eating sugar is so bad. Even if you're not making plans about restricting it, it can just be this idea that as you're eating something, you're simultaneously telling yourself that it's bad for you, right? Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have nutritional awareness. It doesn't mean that you can't have some kind of like, yes, I'm eating cake and it has sugar in it. Okay, but what you do with that information and the way that you apply that information is everything. So once again, in my Refining Intuitive course, we talk about allowing ourselves to understand basic nutritional principles and be like, yeah, if I'm eating cake 3 times a day, it's perfectly reasonable for me to look at that and say, like, all right, I might want to get some other nutrients in here. Having cake 3 times a day or whatever it might be isn't the best thing for my health. Fine. But if you're looking at that same exact information and drawing those same exact conclusions and saying, you got to really get it together, or we're going to go no sugar, or you're so bad for doing this, or what's wrong with me, or just that finger wagging around, in your head at yourself every day, that is the part. It's that psychological experience that gets a root in and contaminates the rest. So a part of that is that inevitably, many people who have thought this way about food and had the judgments around food being bad for you or eating too much or whatever it is or needing to lose weight have at some point implemented some strategy to fix it, right? Whether that's been a diet that they've been on or a lifestyle change like higher protein and low carb or low sugar, or just not eating snacks after 6 p.m. or not having any food between meals or whatever, right? And if those strategies became like where the rules start to take over any kind of flexibility, the body perceives the restriction in a way that it then starts to predict it. So if you are thinking about, ooh, I'm eating so much sugar, I should really go back to that low sugar plan I did 3 years ago. That worked really well for me back then. I just can't seem to get a handle on it anymore. I don't know what my problem is, but you know what? I really should get serious. Your brain's like, oh yeah, we've done that before. I'm going to collect the sugar now, because your psychology doesn't like being restricted. I think that this is also one of those things where the food rebel comes in, and I'm an advocate of sitting down with the food rebel and admiring its protective mechanisms in some ways, because part of what the food rebel does is it says, I don't want to be limited in these kinds of rules. I don't agree with this. I've been there before, and potentially, too much weight too fast that way before. Or I remember when we couldn't enjoy our own birthday cake because of that, or everyone else was enjoying an ice cream cone and we were kind of just like standing there saying, oh, I can't, I'm going to have my whatever else snack you brought that was like subpar. The brain's like, I don't want to do that again, and it perceives just the thoughts as a premonition of lack of access, and then it rallies to protect against that. Now, again, we run up into this idea because these conversations really require nuance. It almost leads one to believe, well, does that mean that if I ever want to decrease my sugar intake or eat more protein because I'm trying to build muscle, or I heard it's good for people in menopause or whatever else, that I can't do that without risking mental restriction? And again, just like with physical restriction, no, this is not the case. It's not true that every single nutritional endeavor that you ever want to offer yourself is automatically mental restriction. It's not. Again, it's going to come down to the energy with which you apply it. So when we tell ourselves we're going to eat less sugar, are we actually going too far and too extreme with that? Are we saying like no sugar? I saw a reel the other day of somebody who was sitting in an art class, and she was recording the audio of people talking around her who had just gone on this new plan for January, like no flour, no sugar, no grains, no alcohol, no this, no that. And sometimes I think when we're like, I got to get myself together, we go into these drastic measures, these black and white ways of doing it. And that could be just like, sometimes it's just too much. Sometimes the body's like, that is just too much restriction. I know, and is that happening? Or are we having flexibility with it? And that this matters a lot. But also, are we doing something because it's socially prescribed, or are we doing something because we've actually felt the instinct for it? So I'll give you an example of this too. So after my first, I don't know if it was like I think it was by my second year of recovering from 25 years of binging and restricting and all the things. I started to, because in the beginning, I was like, I don't want to look at a vegetable really. I didn't have an interest in things like sweet potatoes or grilled chicken or salmon or broccoli or hemp seeds or chia seeds or any of these things that I used to live on. But there came a time, a year and a half ish to 2 years in, where my digestion started getting a little funky. And I just remember feeling like, I haven't had as many vegetables in my life in the past couple of years in the name of recovery as I think I'd like to, from a basic nutritional standpoint. And I was noticing my digestion was ick. And so I remember being like, oh, maybe I should have some like leafy greens. And I remember specifically thinking about spinach, because that was one food that always impacted me well. Like my digestion was really good with some spinach, like sautéed spinach, in my life. And I remember feeling this way when I thought about intentionally moving towards it, because there was a part of me that was like, hey, now intention with nutrition, like we've been here before, and I don't know, is this safe? And there was a period of time where I really had to work on talking my nervous system down from the defense of this. And this happens to a lot of people, where people are kind of afraid to approach anything that has to do with nutrition because the only way that they've ever done that before is through a restrictive mindset. And that's inherently limiting. So there are ways to work on being able to act on your own behalf and eat in a nutritionally supportive way without restricting. But it really does have to first be decoupled from all of that attachment and morality. And so in any phase of recovery from a food dysfunction, usually step one, layer one, foundation one is the deprogramming, the deconstruction of all of these moral associations we have with food. And the mental restriction piece of this is going to be huge. because that's where all that judgment and attachment's taking place. It's all the beliefs we've inherited. It's all the things Oprah ever said that never got out of our head, right? Like I still to this day, sometimes if I look at the clock at 6 o'clock at night, I remember Oprah saying that like that was the cutoff and that's when you close the kitchen. That was how she lost all that weight in the 90s or whatever it was. And you can't forget these things, right? Like even if you don't subscribe to them anymore and logically you can talk it away, there is a programming that has taken place in all of us. And undoing that and disattaching from that is time consuming work. And it's hard. It's hard to get that out of the fear center that can light up when we're thinking about if we're doing something wrong with food. One other way, by the way, that mental restriction takes place is through that constant negotiating. So for those of you who identify with being overthinkers or perfectionists, sometimes that analysis paralysis of like, I want to eat the sandwich, but I don't, I already had bread this morning and I should really have this because this is healthier and da 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 da. That's a really clear sign that there's some mental restriction going on, because where it's not just a straightforward consideration, choice point, okay, decision made, and there's more of this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, that implies that there's some attachment, right? That there's something else in here there's parts that are fighting with each other. There's one part that's attached to one thing and there's another part that's fighting for something else. There's stress in that response. So if you feel like you're always trying to figure out what the right thing to eat is and you find it hard to make decisions because you have too much internal conflict, that's also an experience of mental restriction. Now, how we work out of that is a deconstruction of ideas. And one of the ways that I work with people on this is in WhatsApp, because when you eat food every day and you're thinking about those choices every day, multiple times a day, potentially for many, many hours of the day. And so when I work with clients and they come into WhatsApp and they sort of talk me through by leaving a voice message or a text message, like what happened during lunch or how they negotiated feeling hungry between lunch and dinner and how they made, did they have a snack and what it was and how it went. A lot of times what I'm hearing in there as they're kind of talking me through what they were going through is the negotiation or is the morality or are the beliefs, right? So when we can get more in the moment with, okay, can we identify here what the self-talk looked like? And like within it, can we see all the rules and expectations that we have here? And even just putting some attention on hearing oneself, because we're not investigating our own brains and our own thoughts. We're usually it's just the default pattern. It's just the water we're swimming in. But when we're talking to somebody else, or if you work with a therapist and you talk to your therapist about the way you make decisions around food, sometimes that shines a light on all of the parts and all of the rules that are going on under the surface. And day by day by day to be questioning things and breaking these things down and looking at them and reframing them in new ways. I think that the negotiation of that over time is how we start to poke holes in some of the ways that we just simply have been operating around food rules. Mental restriction deconstruction is a very intricate process, and I think it's a long process, and I think it comes from in context investigation of what we're thinking every day around food. So let's talk now about emotional restriction. All right, this one is less discussed, less understood. Emotional restriction, I think, it's different from physical and mental restriction, which tend to be more like diet culture, wellness culture driven. Emotional restriction isn't so much. It can absolutely blend with those two. And by the way, you can be restricting in all four of the ways I'm going to talk about today, absolutely at one time. And actually, that's why this is a very complicated process. But emotional restriction is something that can exist even all by itself, absent of food morality. Emotional restriction is the restriction of the emotions, not of the food. So it's actually using food to restrict the emotions. Let me give you an example of this. So I have a client who has a friend that she works with every day it's a complicated relationship. She has been friends with this person for a long time. There's a lot of benefits to the friendship, but there's also a lot of resentment in the friendship. There's an inequitable dynamic at times where the way that the relationship is set up is that one is the helper and the fixer and the giver, and one is the receiver. And my client experiences resentment and sometimes anger when she interacts with this friend. However, she doesn't like that she experiences that. She was raised in a home where being angry was a frowned upon emotion. So there's that. And also, it makes her uncomfortable to feel this resentment towards somebody that she also simultaneously values and is part of her everyday life. So when this feeling rises in her, she acknowledges it. It's not like she immediately pushes it back down, but she can express it to a certain point and then she becomes uncomfortable with having it. It's not a nice feeling in her body. She doesn't like it psychologically. She doesn't like the way it feels. She feels stuck there and she'll come home from work and binge if she's had an interaction with this friend that has brought up these feelings. So in this way, what the food is doing is it's taking over for the completion of that emotional cycle. So in the absence of kind of like knowing what to do with the feeling, she just eats. And by the way, if you are somebody who follows this podcast who doesn't necessarily struggle with that side of it, but struggles with the restriction side of it, you might also restrict at this moment, right? So there's emotional restriction is just the restriction of emotions. It's not about food or not food. You can emotionally restrict by restricting food, or you can emotionally restrict by eating food. The point is that you're using food in some way to take over for uncomfortable emotions. Other ways that emotional restriction can take place is by minimizing our own emotions, by feeling like, oh my gosh, you're just overreacting, you're being dramatic, you shouldn't feel this way, that wasn't a big deal, or completely denying certain emotions exist. Anger and jealousy, I think, are two of the big ones that I see the most. Oh, I shouldn't say that. I think sadness can also be, but maybe right now in the people I'm working with, like anger and jealousy are one of the ones that people feel so much shame about feeling. And as such, in order to prevent that rise, because jealousy and anger are active, right? There's heat in the body with those. And as that heat starts to rise, there can be like like push that down, like get out of here, you know? Um, and I think this is also the reason why we emotionally eat, by the way. Emotional eating is essentially eating to either replace an emotion, to push down an emotion, or even to supplement it, because sometimes the comfort of the food can be a way that we're comforting the experience of the emotion. And emotional eating, by the way, has a place. It's not pathological. It becomes an issue when that's the only way that we know how to cope with emotions once they cross a certain threshold, or just how we deal with certain emotions, right? Like if every single time that we're getting angry, we're eating and emotionally eating because of that, that becomes a problem because anger is a human emotion and we're going to run into it frequently, potentially, or at least frustrations and irritations. But emotional eating itself is not the problem. It's the chronic suppression of emotions through food. This one is one also that I find emotional restriction is the most common with people pleasers, perfectionists, and trauma. So when it comes to trauma, emotions can be very uncontained and they can take up a lot of space in the body, as emotions do, because emotions actually do live in the body. And anyone who's had trauma, who has either had body-based trauma or just has been helpless with really big emotion at one time, in addition to being a human in the world who probably never really learned how to cope with emotions because we don't as kids and as adolescents, I think now they're doing this more, but it certainly wasn't something that I didn't know. Emotions weren't things that my parents even necessarily taught me how to cope with beyond maybe just more dismissal or overriding, but those who have been through trauma on top of that are really sometimes overwhelmed with big emotions. Highly sensitive people can also be in this cohort because having a lot of emotion running through the body, having high sensitivity and a sensitive nervous system that is picking up on a lot of emotions and experiencing emotions really deeply, it's a lot. And in the absence of having tools for that, we have a tool for that, right? Like we food is a really effective soothing agent. It's a really effective distraction. It almost creates a different emotion. Like I'm somebody who had trouble, I have trouble being sad. I find it overwhelming to be sad. I find overwhelm actually to be the worst one. And overwhelm is one that I have trouble with overwhelm. I have to really think about applying my somatic tools for overwhelm. And food can really quiet some of that. Sometimes I look back at my behaviors with food and I think in times when I was the most overwhelmed, and then I would binge, and then I would make myself angry at myself because I binged. And how convenient that might have been, because what I did was I kind of got away from the overwhelm of the things that didn't have an answer. And I went and instead got really angry at myself. And anger was an emotion I could do and I was comfortable with and I could predict, like I understood anger at myself, which was much more a controllable variable, at least in theory. And I think about how smart that was. Like I could easily dodge overwhelm about relationships and life at large and like what I wanted to do with my life, or even just practical stresses and overwhelms of being a human in the world, especially right now, to redirect that energy towards an emotion that we know how to deal with. It's one way out. Except, of course, that it's not, obviously in the long run, but it is in the short term. And so a lot of what we do, a lot of the behaviors that we have with food and when it comes to overeating and binge eating, it's about that short term. I got to get out of here right now. I don't care what happens later. I just got to get out of here right now. And that's part of that primal brain processing that we've talked about in previous episodes. For emotional restriction in particular, this is why I got into somatic work, because I was finding that I was working with clients, and some of the clients I work with where physical and mental restriction are the main players. Working with that there's a lot of layers and complexity there, but that is something that when you do that work, it goes a really long way. It's life changing to address physical and mental restriction. It's one of my favorite things to do with people. But I was finding that there were clients I was working with where that was important, and I think physical and mental restriction are probably present to some degree, one or the other of them, if not both, in almost everybody at some point. And so deconstructing that is always going to be relevant. But then there was like this other layer of where the binging or numbing out with food and that was happening for people in a way that wasn't about even body size or diet culture. It was about emotions and how to deal with that and how to look at this, especially where, trauma was this intersection, was how I got into somatic therapy. And so somatic therapy or somatic practices and understanding the nervous system is my kind of go-to piece of advice for those who struggle with emotional restriction, to really get closer to the body and the body's experience of an emotion, because learning how to hold emotions in the body and as well as the mind, because it's a psychological experience as well, is just a completely different approach that adds dimension to recovery if you haven't found success working just on physical and mental restriction. Now I want to talk about the fourth kind of restriction, which I'm introducing today, literally for the first time, which is nervous system restriction. I bet you could have guessed that if you followed me for a long enough period of time. I want to explain what this is. And I also want to name that I'm putting out an essay on Substack for my paid subscribers on this concept specifically, because I have a lot to say about it. I've never talked about it before, and I want to really go a little bit more deep diving into this concept for people. I struggled with naming this one for a while because it does brush up against emotional restriction in a lot of ways. And so I've been thinking about what's the difference between emotional restriction and nervous system restriction in the way that I could sense it in my own body. I could feel the difference, but I couldn't necessarily find the words for it. And I've found the words for it. And I'm going to explain the difference between emotional restriction and nervous system restriction at the end of introducing what nervous system restriction is. Okay, so nervous system restriction is where we restrict the physiological experience of a stress cycle from finishing, from completing, from resolving. So a quick 101 of nervous system regulation, or how the nervous system works with stress, is that when we have a stress, a trigger, whatever that is, whether that's an emotion or a critical thought in our head, a food rule, a comparison, a diet culture headline, or just maybe nothing even to do with food at all. Like, let's say you're a mom and you're simply just you're just stressed out because you have to make dinner and do a million things and you're tired, anything that we perceive as stress. We open a stress loop, right? The nervous system opens a stress loop. There's activation. There's some kind of trigger that activates an energy in the body that's like, hey, like something's happening. What do we do? And depending on how high that stress gets, the body will decide what to do. So it will either mobilize to address it so that it can find a resolution for it, And that's the typical way, right? That's more of the quintessential way that a stress works. Like we get activated, we deal with the threat, and then we resolve it, right? But in cases of dysregulation where either the stress keeps coming or we don't have the capacity to hold the activation, sometimes that activation gets dysregulated and we end up going into more of a fight or flight. So this is where maybe the mind will absorb some of the energy running through the body and start to really think and ruminate and get upset and get stressed out. And that can carry on for a while. And it's not necessarily finding resolution. It's just kind of like that energy just keeps moving, moving, moving. And if it moves for long enough, eventually sometimes it just freezes or it collapses. It considers itself helpless. And we're like, I can't do this. I can't overcome this stress. Everything's too much for me. And we sort of get stuck in one of these places, either the freeze response, the collapse, or the fight or flight, where we just stay in a state of anxiety all the time. When our nervous system is dysregulated and it can't move through those two things, the freeze response, and this is very, by the way, broad strokes around describing this, but it just kind of gets stuck there in one of those two places and it doesn't find that resolution. That's the place where food might happen. So if the body itself can't necessarily close the loop, food might come in to do it, to ground some of that activation or to mobilize again if we've frozen, right? So this is, I have a term that I have talked about before called regulating, and regulating is a play on regulating, and it's using food to regulate the part of the nervous system that's gotten stuck. So for example, if I find myself really frustrated at something and I don't perceive that I can fix it or do anything about it. And knowing me, if you know me, my nervous system will go more fight or flight, right? So I'll go up into fight or flight and I'll be like, and I'll just start to like think a lot about it. I'll start to project and I'll start to ruminate and I'll start to feel tension in my body. And then everything I'm doing for the rest of the day sort of is has this kind of energy underneath it. And I feel really irritable. And I've just got this constant mobilization in the body that it's not finding a resolution anywhere. And then I go into my pantry and I see a bag of chips or cereal, right? And this one was big for me. I actually used to do this all the time. A granola, like granola cereal. You know how granola is like it'll break your teeth if it's hard enough. That crunch and it's so dense. And like I would just pour bowls of granola and the milk and the texture of it too. And in that rhythmic crunching, grounding into the jaw where we carry a lot of tension, by the way, and just like over and over and over. And then the density in my stomach, like the whole experience by the end of it, when you took away the narrative about what I was doing, when you took away my thoughts, the physical experience of eating a big bowl of crunchy granola with cold milk was so soothing to my body. It grounded some of that mobilized energy that was all the way up here, like going like this. It would pull it down, thereby completing the stress cycle. Because really what a mobilized energy needs is right to come back down. It can't stay up here for too long. I mean, it's meant to do up here so we can act on our own behalf, but then it's meant to come down. And that is how we may use food where the nervous system has been restricted from completing its stress cycle. Now, emotions live in the body and are responsible. They directly intersect with the nervous system here. Like emotions essentially are the physiological experience of stress, or like, and when I say stress, I don't just mean the way we talk colloquially about stress. I mean like any kind of anything. Even happiness is part of a stress, right? It's immobilizing. There's energy in the body. That's what emotions are, is energy in the body, even if it's positive or whatever. But the difference between an emotion and a nervous system cycle is affect and story and meaning. So an emotion, and there's a book, it's very thick, and I admittedly did not read the entire thing, but it's How Emotions Are Made. It's by Lisa Feldman Barrett. And part of how emotions are characterized is it's the meaning making as well. So it's not just the physiological experience, it's also the stories that come from that experience, the way that we predict outcomes and have almost like a separate experience based on how something feels. So for example, panic or fear, is something that actually happens in the body. There's a physiological experience of that. But then the way that our brain interprets that is also part of the emotion of it, right? So we also predict that something bad might happen. And the way that we understand fear and make meaning of fear or the thing we're afraid of is the emotional experience. It's beyond just the physiological. It's the same thing as vision. And as an OT, like we used to look at the different components of vision. It's not just one thing. You've got one part of your eye that takes in the information itself, like the data, the raw data, and it transports it back to the brain. And then there's the other part, another part that interprets the data. And so it's the same thing here, where the nervous system is that raw data. It's the physiological experience of a thing in the body. The emotion is that plus like the meaning making of it, the way that we psychologically experience that data. This is why you can do all the nervous system work in the world. You can do cold plunges. You can do yoga. You can do meditations. You can do vagus nerve stimulation. You can go through all the motions of nervous system regulation work and never touch the emotion. Because if you're not psychologically prepared to also work with the story and the meaning and the experience of feeling in your whole self what that means, what the emotion is, it's a half job, right? And likewise, we can spend a lot of time in emotional work and journaling and really getting at the depths of our pain and anger and sadness and all these, but we may have physiological stress loops open in the body where we sort of intellectualize the emotion, but we haven't looked at the body. So I really do. I think that emotional restriction and nervous system restriction based eating are really connected. They're like two halves of the same thing, in the same way that physical and mental restriction are also, they're connected. They're like brothers and sisters, and together they're all cousins. But now the other thing about this is there's one other component to nervous system restriction that is really important to note. If you listen to my episode from several months ago called "The Body Keeps the Score," which is not my term, that's a book, and the episode was just about how that applies to food and body image. But I talk there about our relationship to food as safe. If we have experiences where food has been a safe thing for us, whether because we restricted it at one time and the body learned to covet it for its survival properties, or because it served to keep us out of overwhelm from a traumatic event at one time or something like that. If you've got a coding in your body of food as safety, which by the way, we all do anyway, because we're humans, then during times of nervous system activation, there might be a case where the system can't hold all of the activation that is there, and it does need food, even if you physically don't. And that's a hard thing to even say, actually, like, because who's to say what need really is? But I mean, even if your physical body, for all intents and purposes, calorically doesn't need more food, quote unquote, from like the organ system point of view, like just basic functioning to keep your body alive, your nervous system might need it anyway to help complete a safety cycle. I notice this when I'm stressed about it. There's a certain kind of stress that I get like kind of anxious about certain things. And sometimes I need food. I can tell that like I need food, not just to ground me. It's not just about that grounding principle. It's literally like my body's looking for a symbol of safety, and food is the only thing it will accept, and I need to eat. And I have found that I've actually honored this. I don't emotionally eat, so to speak, but I nervous system eat. And I've been doing this since I recovered, and I have honored it each and every time. It doesn't run away with me. It doesn't get out of control. It's just like this symbolic gesture of my nervous system needing food to feel safe, like a security blanket almost. And I have had stable recovery. I've had even a stable weight for years, honoring my nervous system needs when it comes to this, because the nervous system, when it's in overwhelm, is looking for what it has historically understood is the safest thing in response to this heightened activation. And it sometimes just needs it. And not all the time. And that's something that we can also be working with. Where that gets to be a problem is when it intersects with mental restriction. So this is where they start to cross. So if I was in a position where I was perceiving that I needed food because I was stressed, not to escape, not to suppress an emotion, but to actually finish a stress cycle, right? And I can feel this really distinctly in my body when I need it in this way. It feels like an energy in the body that I don't, this is something I do have to continue to work on expressing. Like it's something I've gotten to know more and more and been paying attention to over the years because it's a feeling I get. And I know that there's nothing else that will help me in that moment but food. But if I start to judge that or get afraid of that, then mental restriction comes in. And now I've got both. I've got a nervous system that's saying I need some food. I need some food to regulate. And I've got a brain that's saying that that's bad and wrong and I'm going to gain weight from that. When that happens, then you're bound to keep eating, keep eating, keep eating, keep eating. And then you're meta eating because you're blocking the safety from happening because your brain is literally coming in and been like, this isn't safe. And then it can't do its job. So when we're talking about this, like eating in response to nervous system safety needs, it's incredibly important to be also simultaneously working on mental restriction, or the same is going to be true for emotional eating, by the way, too. Like if we're judging it, you're blocking the safety that the body's actually looking for. What I find is, and I've used this example so many times, when I have to write an essay, like, or my Wednesday weekly emails, and I always get a little activated. It's not a bad thing. I was like, oh, I hope it's good. What am I going to write about? And I'll get a little bit like buzzy in my chest. And every time I do, I eat more. And I used to think I just got hungrier when I was, and maybe that's part of it. Maybe my nervous system is rallying and actually getting hungrier. But I can tell that it's like my body, when it's like that, when it's buzzing, needs food to help it find safety again. And I can do that without like needing constant food more and more and more, because it's allowed to come in. There's no judgment about it. My body registers the safety and then it moves along. And that phenomenon is why I have introduced this concept, because there was nothing out there that I have seen that adequately describes this experience. And I experience it so poignantly. I'm also suspect I'm neurodivergent. I think it may be also something, and working with many clients with neurodivergence, I think this is something I see there. I see that the nervous system is more vulnerable to needing this kind of safety coming, this kind of safety coming down. And does this mean that you always and forevermore will need food to soothe the nervous system? No, not necessarily. And I don't think it doesn't necessarily need a lot of food. It's just that sometimes there's a call to help the nervous system out, to help it ground itself, to help it find a safety cue. And sometimes that safety cue is food, especially if we have a history of food as a safety cue. And I say this confidently, I do not think that has to be a bad thing. I think it fits into what the body needs. Again, I have experienced extreme amount of stability of all the things that I've ever done in my life. My recovery with food is I don't have any doubt. There is no part of me that questions my regulation with food. Like I got this. And I need food as safety sometimes in this way. And it fits into recovery in a way that enhances it, actually. And I'm very attuned to the body in this way. And I've not heard anybody ever speak about it. And I look forward to talking about it more and thinking about it more and applying all the things I'm learning all the time to how it's interpreted. But I did want to bring it up here. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if you've experienced anything like this or if you have questions about it. And yeah, my contact is still bothering me and I cannot really see out of it. So I hope you haven't even noticed if you're watching me on YouTube. And if you're not, well, lucky you. One last thought here. So my binge eating to intuitive eating recovery course is how I put together the concepts of mental restriction, physical restriction, and emotional restriction, and combine that with intuitive eating principles for a 12-week self-study course that is available on my website. There are also somatic videos that are included in the coursework in that self-study program to bring in this nervous system component. What was interesting is that as I was going through my last round of the live cohort, which runs every fall, it's always available on my website for self-study, but it's in the fall, it's live. And I was noticing how, even without knowing it, without ever having this term for it at that time when I created the course, that it was embedded in there. Like there were things that I was talking about that I didn't necessarily label nervous system restriction or like how to work with nervous system restriction. And it's in the course itself, just through what I think was just my instinct for it at the time. So if you are somebody who is looking for more help with how do I address physical, mental, emotional, and nervous system restriction? That course is probably it is the best place to start. It houses all of my theories inside of that course. It is a wonderful jumping off point if this is new information for you and you're looking to dive more deeply into it. I am also opening up something called the Cocoon in a few months, which is going to be more of a community based platform where I am providing exercises and activities based on some of these things, as well as meetings for us to be talking to each other about these kinds of concepts. But the deep dive is really in the BE to IE course, binge eating to intuitive eating, if that is something that is relevant for you. There is help available. Just visit my website. And in the meantime, I hope you all have a really nice week and stay warm. It's snowing out here today, so I can't believe that we're almost at the end of January. All right. Well, I'll see you next week.